Hello there, and welcome to Secretum Histories. Thank you for being here tonight wherever you are in the world, and for choosing to spend this quiet stretch of time exploring the oldest written memories humanity ever left behind. This channel exists for moments like this, when the noise of the day fades, the outside world slows, and curiosity is allowed to drift gently without urgency or expectation. The stories told here are not meant to demand attention or deliver conclusions. They are meant to unfold slowly, patiently, allowing the mind to rest while history speaks in its own measured voice. Tonight, we're easing into a subject that sits quietly beneath some of the most famous Sumerian narratives, a subject that the tablets never announced directly but returned to again and again in careful, restrained language. It is not a story about conquest or dominance, not about beings arriving fully formed and eternal, immune to the conditions of the world they entered. Instead, it is about necessity, about limitation, about what it meant for powerful beings to exist within a place that was not originally theirs, and what had to be done, continuously and deliberately, for that existence to be sustained. If you find this kind of exploration calming or grounding, feel free to settle in comfortably, perhaps lower the lights, let the background sounds soften, and allow the story to move at its own pace. Support for the channel through quiet appreciation or continued listening helps these long-form histories continue to exist, but there is no rush and no obligation. This is time set aside for reflection rather than instruction. The Sumerian tablets, when read carefully and without modern expectation imposed upon them, do something very subtle. They never describe the Anunnaki as endlessly self-sustaining. They do not speak of absolute immortality in the way later religious traditions would come to imagine divine beings. Instead, they describe gods who eat, who drink, who rest, who argue, who grow weary, and who react when conditions threaten their continued presence. This alone should give pause, because it reframes the entire relationship between these beings and the world they inhabited. Survival, not supremacy, sits quietly at the centre of the story. Earth, as described in the oldest texts, was not a neutral stage. It was a structured environment with its own rules, rhythms and demands. Time moved. Resources had to be managed. Order had to be maintained against constant pressure from chaos. Even the gods were not exempt from this reality. The world they entered required adaptation, and adaptation always comes with cost. The earliest layers of Sumerian writing are careful with their language. They do not exaggerate. They do not dramatize. They assume familiarity with concepts that later generations would struggle to understand. When the tablets describe gods receiving offerings, dwelling in temples, establishing roles for humans and organizing labor, they are not speaking symbolically in the way modern readers often assume. They are describing systems, processes, methods through which divine presence could continue without destabilizing the world that supported it. What becomes increasingly clear when the texts are allowed to speak without interruption is that the Anunnaki were not sustained by Earth automatically. They required alignment with its conditions. They required structured interaction with its resources. They required support systems that were maintained through ritual, labor, and careful division of responsibility. This was not incidental. It was foundational. The gods needed food, though not always in the same form humans consumed it. They needed clean water flowing from the deep places beneath the land. They needed rest, quiet, and separation from the constant activity of human life. They needed environments that were kept orderly, protected from decay and neglect. And above all, they needed humans, not as slaves in the dramatic sense often imagined, but as caretakers of balance, maintaining the systems that allowed divine presence to remain stable. The tablets describe this relationship with remarkable clarity. When offerings ceased, gods weakened. When temples fell into disrepair, divine attention withdrew. When humans multiplied too quickly, noise disrupted divine rest. These are not metaphors. They are descriptions of cause and effect within a cosmological framework that assumed gods were powerful but not infinite. This changes how survival is understood. Survival was not about escaping death alone. It was about remaining viable within a world governed by cycles, limits, and consequences. The Anunnaki, as presented in the earliest texts, existed within these constraints. They were participants in the system, not external rulers immune to its demands. Even the organization of the pantheon reflects this reality. Responsibilities were distributed. Domains were assigned. Oversight was structured. No single deity managed everything, because no single being could sustain all aspects of existence alone. This division was not political, it was practical. The idea that gods required ongoing maintenance may feel uncomfortable to modern assumptions about divinity, but to the Sumerians it was simply reality. Existence required work. Order required attention. Presence required support. Without these things, even the most powerful beings would fade, withdraw, or be forced to relinquish their place. As this story unfolds, the focus will not be on spectacle or speculation, but on what the tablets consistently imply: that life on Earth, even for gods, demanded accommodation, that survival was not guaranteed by origin or power, but by continued alignment with the world's structure, and that humanity's role, from the very beginning, was tied to sustaining that alignment. The tablets never rush this idea. They let it emerge gradually, through lists, hymns, administrative records, and mythological narratives that quietly reinforce the same pattern. The Anunnaki did not arrive to dominate a lifeless planet. They entered an environment already shaped by water, time, and order, and they had to learn how to remain within it. This is where the story truly begins, not with arrival, but with adjustment, not with authority, but with need. And as we move forward, the details will become clearer, one layer at a time, revealing how survival shaped divine behaviour long before later traditions rewrote the story into something simpler and far less human. The idea that gods were eternal is so deeply embedded in later religious traditions that it feels almost instinctive, as if divinity and endless existence must naturally belong together. But when the earlier Sumerian tablets are read slowly and without that expectation imposed upon them, something very different emerges. The gods described there are powerful, certainly. They shape order, assign roles, and influence the world in ways humans cannot. Yet they are never presented as beings who exist independently of the conditions around them. Their presence is sustained, not automatic. Their continued existence depends on systems that must function correctly, and when those systems falter, the gods respond not with indifference, but with concern, irritation, and sometimes fear. The Sumerians did not describe a universe where divine beings floated above reality, untouched by its constraints. Instead, they described a world where even the highest powers were embedded within structure. The gods lived somewhere. They resided in specific places. They occupied domains that had boundaries. They required order to remain stable. Without that order, their position weakened. This is not stated in a single dramatic line anywhere in the tablets. It is revealed through repetition, through administrative language, through ritual instructions, through stories that quietly assume the listener already understands this truth. One of the most telling details is how often the texts describe gods as receiving. They receive offerings, they receive praise, they receive service, they receive maintenance. This language is not symbolic in the abstract sense. It reflects a transactional reality built into the cosmos as the Sumerians understood it. Something flows upward, and in return something flows downward. When the flow stops, imbalance follows. The gods eat. This is stated plainly in multiple texts. Not metaphorically, not as an allegory for worship, but as an activity that occurs at specific times and in specific ways. Feasts are prepared for them, food is placed before them, beer is poured, bread is baked, incense is burned. The tablets describe the gods gathering to consume these offerings, enjoying them, and reacting when they are withheld. A god who does not receive offerings becomes restless. A neglected deity grows angry or distant. This is not the behavior of a being that exists beyond dependency. Water is another constant presence in these descriptions. Fresh water, drawn from the depths of the earth, holds particular importance. The Abzu, the subterranean waters beneath the land, are not merely symbolic. They are treated as a real, sustaining force, essential not only for crops and humans, but for the gods themselves. Certain deities are explicitly associated with these waters, and their vitality is linked to their access to them. When the waters are disturbed, polluted, or blocked, divine order suffers. Even rest is required. The gods sleep. They seek quiet. They withdraw when disturbed. One of the most revealing aspects of the flood narratives is not the destruction itself, but the reason given for it. Humanity's noise becomes unbearable. The gods cannot sleep. Their rest is disrupted, and this disruption threatens their well-being. This detail is often dismissed as anthropomorphic storytelling, but within the Sumerian worldview it carries weight. Sleep is not a luxury, it is a requirement for stability. The gods, like humans, cannot function without it. This dependence extends to place. The gods are not everywhere at once in the Sumerian imagination. They are present where their temples stand. Their power radiates outward from specific locations. Temples are not symbolic houses. They are functional residences. They must be cleaned, repaired, supplied, and protected. When a temple falls into disrepair, the god associated with it weakens or withdraws. This withdrawal is not immediate annihilation, but it is a loss of presence, a thinning of influence. The tablets are filled with records of temple inventories, rations, repairs, and personnel assignments. These are not mythological texts. They are administrative documents written by scribes who tracked grain deliveries, livestock counts, and labour schedules. And woven into these records is the assumption that divine sustenance depends on human action. The gods do not manifest resources out of nothing. They rely on systems maintained by people. This reliance does not diminish their authority in the Sumerian worldview. On the contrary, it reinforces it. The gods are powerful precisely because they are integrated into the structure of existence. They are not external intruders imposing order from outside. They are participants in a system that must be continually balanced. Their power lies in coordination, not isolation. The Anunnaki, as a group, fit squarely within this framework. They are never described as beings who exist independently of the cosmos. They are born, they occupy roles, they perform functions, they are subject to councils and decisions. Their authority is real, but it is contextual. They depend on the maintenance of cosmic order to retain their position. One of the clearest signs of this dependence is how often the texts describe divine anxiety. The gods fear disorder. They fear overpopulation. They fear rebellion. They fear noise. These fears are not irrational. They arise from the recognition that imbalance threatens their stability. When humans multiply too rapidly, the system strains. When rituals are neglected, the flow of sustenance weakens. When boundaries are crossed, consequences follow. Even mortality, as it applies to gods, is treated differently than in later traditions. While gods do not die in the same way humans do, they are not immune to dissolution. They can be diminished, they can be removed, they can be confined to the underworld, they can lose status, they can be stripped of power. These outcomes are not framed as symbolic punishments. They are functional responses to imbalance. The underworld itself serves as a reminder of this limitation. It is not merely a place for human souls. It is a domain that even gods must respect. Certain deities rule there. Others fear it. Descent into the underworld is dangerous even for powerful beings. Entry requires permission. Exit is not guaranteed. This alone undermines the idea of divine invulnerability. The Sumerians understood existence as layered, structured, and conditional. Nothing exists without context. Nothing functions without support. This includes the gods. Their divinity does not exempt them from the need to maintain harmony with the world they inhabit. This perspective also explains why the gods are so deeply involved in regulation. They assign tasks, they establish laws, they determine fates, they intervene when systems threaten to collapse. These actions are not expressions of boredom or cruelty. They are acts of preservation. The gods act to protect the conditions that allow them to remain present. Humanity's role becomes clearer within this framework. Humans are not created simply to serve as labourers in a crude sense. They are created to stabilise the system, to perform the work that gods cannot or will not do themselves, to maintain temples, to prepare offerings, to manage land and water, to absorb noise and disorder so that divine spaces remain quiet and controlled. When humans fail in this role, consequences follow. When they succeed too well, consequences also follow. Balance is narrow. The gods walk a careful line, adjusting conditions to preserve their own sustainability. This dependency does not make the gods weak. It makes them real within their own cosmology. They are not abstract ideals. They are beings with needs, preferences, and limitations. They exist because the world supports them, and the world remains ordered because they manage it. The Sumerian tablets never explain this outright. They assume it. They record it. They reflect it in every detail of ritual and myth. Later cultures would reinterpret these gods as eternal, all-powerful, and self-sustaining. But that was not how they were originally understood. To the Sumerians, even gods had to endure. Even gods had to adapt. Even gods had to remain alive within a world that did not bend endlessly to their will. And it is within this quiet acknowledgement of limitation that the deeper story begins to take shape, leading naturally toward the question of what Earth demanded from them, and why remaining here required constant effort rather than effortless dominion. Earth is often imagined in later mythologies as a gift, a fertile stage prepared for divine presence, a realm shaped deliberately to welcome gods and humans alike. But the Sumerian tablets do not describe the world in this way. They describe a place that was unstable, demanding and resistant even to divine control. A world that did not naturally sustain order, and certainly did not sustain life without constant effort. This was not a gentle environment waiting to be ruled. It was a system that pushed back, that eroded structures, disrupted balance, and imposed limits that even the gods had to respect. From the earliest texts, the world is presented as something that must be managed continuously. Order does not persist on its own. Left unattended, land floods, canals silt up, cities decay, boundaries collapse, and chaos reasserts itself. This hostility is not framed as malevolence, but as a fundamental property of existence. The earth resists permanence, it wears things down, it demands maintenance, and this reality applies equally to divine and human presence. The climate alone made survival an ongoing challenge. Southern Mesopotamia was a land of extremes. Long periods of heat and drought were interrupted by sudden destructive floods. Rivers that brought life could just as easily bring devastation. The same waters that fertilized fields could drown entire cities if not carefully controlled. This volatility shaped how the Sumerians understood the world itself. Nature was not a passive backdrop. It was an active force that could overwhelm even the most carefully constructed systems. The gods, as described in the tablets, did not override these conditions effortlessly. They worked within them. They established irrigation networks. They assigned deities to oversee canals and fields. They intervened when storms became too violent or when drought threatened crops. These actions are not portrayed as demonstrations of absolute control, but as responses to ongoing instability. The world required constant correction. The very structure of the cosmos reflects this hostility. Heaven and earth had to be forcibly separated. The space between them had to be created through violence. Air did not exist naturally as a stable realm. It was carved out, claimed, and defended. This act alone signals that the natural state of existence was not conducive to life or order. It had to be altered aggressively before anything could function. Even after this separation, danger remained. The boundaries between realms were fragile. The underworld pressed upward. The waters of the deep threatened to break through the surface. The sky held back waters above that could fall at any moment. Existence was suspended between pressures, and collapse was always a possibility. For the gods, residing within this environment meant exposure to its risks. Their temples were not immune to flood or decay. Their cities could be destroyed. Their access to offerings could be disrupted by famine or war. Their quiet could be shattered by human activity. Earth did not protect divine presence. It challenged it. The tablets repeatedly describe gods reacting to environmental stress. When crops fail, gods are appeased. When floods rise, rituals intensify. When disease spreads, divine intervention is sought. These responses reveal an assumption that the gods are affected by these events, not merely observing them from a distance. Their well-being is tied to the stability of the systems humans maintain. Time itself is another hostile factor. It erodes, it diminishes, it transforms. The Sumerians understood time not as a neutral flow, but as something that carried decay. Structures required constant renewal. Rituals had to be repeated. Order had to be reaffirmed. Without repetition, power faded. This is why rituals are so precise in the tablets. They are not symbolic gestures, they are maintenance procedures. They renew divine presence, they stabilize relationships, they counteract entropy. Missed rituals are not simply offenses, they are failures of upkeep. The gods' reliance on these rituals reflects the hostility of the world they inhabited. Earth does not preserve anything indefinitely. It consumes, erodes, and transforms. Even divine power requires reinforcement to remain effective within this environment. Noise is another form of hostility described in the texts. Sound is not neutral. It disrupts divine rest. It destabilizes order. When humanity multiplies, the increase in activity creates constant disturbance. This disturbance is not framed as annoyance alone. It is treated as a threat. Rest is necessary for stability. Without rest, divine order weakens. The flood narratives make this explicit. The decision to send the flood is not rooted in moral judgment, but in environmental overload. The world becomes too loud, too crowded, too unstable. The system cannot sustain the level of activity. The gods respond by resetting conditions. This reset is catastrophic because the world itself is unforgiving. Water overwhelms everything. Structures collapse. Life is wiped away indiscriminately. The flood does not target sinners. It dissolves order. It returns the world to a state that predates civilization. For divine beings, this is not a triumph. It is a last resort. The flood disrupts their own systems. It eliminates the labor that sustains them. It removes offerings. It destroys temples. The gods endure the consequences of this hostility as well. After the flood, new limits are imposed. Human lifespans are reduced. Population growth is controlled. These measures are not punishments alone. They are adaptations. The world cannot sustain unlimited life. Noise must be managed. Resources must be conserved. The gods adjust the system to remain viable within an environment that resists excess. The underworld further reinforces this hostility. It is described as a place of confinement, darkness, and stagnation. Entry is irreversible for most. Even gods who descend there risk losing power or becoming trapped. The underworld is not aligned with divine vitality. It drains it. The existence of such a realm beneath the earth underscores the danger inherent in the world itself. Beneath the surface lies a domain that absorbs and immobilizes. The gods must avoid it. Humans fear it. It is part of the same system that resists permanence. Earth's hostility is not limited to physical forces. Social instability also threatens divine presence. Wars disrupt offerings. Rebellions damage temples. political collapse interrupts ritual continuity. The gods depend on stable societies to maintain their position. This dependence creates vulnerability. When cities fall, gods fall with them. When temples are abandoned, divine presence withdraws. This is not metaphorical death, but functional disappearance. A god without worship fades from relevance. The tablets record this process repeatedly. Cities rise and fall. Gods shift prominence. Divine hierarchies change. These changes reflect environmental and social pressures rather than timeless divine plans. The Anunnaki, operating within this framework, are subject to these same constraints. Their authority does not shield them from the world's hostility. They must maintain order to survive within it. This understanding challenges later interpretations that depict Earth as a resource-rich playground for invulnerable beings. The Sumerian worldview is far more restrained. Earth is difficult. Survival requires effort. Power requires maintenance. The gods do not conquer this world. They negotiate with it. They impose structure where possible, retreat where necessary, and adapt when conditions become too hostile. This is why withdrawal becomes a recurring theme. When the world becomes too unstable, gods distance themselves. Presence becomes symbolic rather than direct. Memory replaces interaction. The hostility of Earth is not something that can be eliminated. It can only be managed temporarily. This reality shapes every aspect of divine behavior in the tablets. Understanding this context is essential for understanding what the gods required to stay alive. Their needs were shaped by a world that did not accommodate them naturally. Their systems evolved in response to constant pressure. As the narrative continues, this hostility will become more specific. The environment demanded energy. It demanded resources. It demanded structure. And meeting these demands required solutions that tied divine survival directly to human action. This is where the relationship between gods and humans becomes not just hierarchical, but symbiotic. And it is from this tension, between a hostile world and the effort to endure within it, that the deeper logic of the tablets begins to emerge. Arrival is often imagined as a moment of completion, a crossing from one state into another, after which adjustment naturally follows. In later mythologies, when gods enter a world, they do so fully formed, immediately aligned with the conditions of their new domain, requiring no further accommodation. But the Sumerian tablets never support this assumption. Arrival, in their account, is not resolution. It is exposure. It marks the beginning of strain rather than the end of it. The texts suggest that the Anunnaki did not step into Earth already suited to it. They entered a system that operated according to its own logic, rhythms and limitations, and those limitations did not yield simply because powerful beings were present. Earth did not reshape itself around them. The burden of adjustment remained, unresolved and ongoing. One of the clearest indicators of this is how frequently the tablets describe corrective action after divine presence is already established. If arrival had meant adaptation, there would be no need for repeated intervention. Yet the gods constantly reorganize, redistribute responsibility, impose new limits, and revise arrangements that have already been put in place. This pattern reveals something essential. Presence alone was insufficient. Simply being here did not make Earth hospitable. The world did not recognize divine authority in the way later traditions would imagine. Floods still came, drought still occurred, disease still spread, structures still collapsed, time still eroded what had been built. The gods responded not by transforming Earth into something else entirely, but by attempting to manage its resistance in pieces through systems layered on top of a fundamentally uncooperative environment. This is why so much of the divine activity described in the tablets focuses on organization rather than transformation. The gods do not remake the planet. They regulate it. They assign oversight. They build channels. They designate roles. These are the actions of beings adapting to constraints, not erasing them. Even the separation of heaven and earth, often treated as a decisive act of cosmic engineering, does not resolve the problem. It creates space, but it does not stabilize that space permanently. The atmosphere becomes a domain that requires governance. Storms emerge as threats rather than features. Wind, which allows life to breathe, also becomes a force of destruction. Nothing introduced by this act exists without consequence. The Anunnaki operate within this fragile architecture. Their arrival places them inside a system already under tension. They do not transcend it. They inherit it, and inheritance comes with limitations. The tablets also suggest that the gods themselves recognize this lack of immediate adaptation. They do not behave as if Earth naturally sustains them. They behave as if continued presence requires support. They establish temples quickly, not as symbols of victory but as anchors, fixed points where conditions can be controlled, where sustenance can be directed, where order can be maintained against the surrounding instability. These spaces are carefully defined. They are elevated, protected, isolated from noise where possible. The effort invested in maintaining these environments indicates that divine presence outside of them was difficult to sustain. Arrival did not make the wider world safe. It required pockets of stability to be constructed and defended. Time is another obstacle that Arrival did not overcome. The gods do not arrive into a timeless realm. Earth imposes duration. Days pass, seasons change, cycles repeat, decay accumulates. The tablets reflect an acute awareness of this. Rituals must be repeated not because gods forget, but because time erodes alignment. Without repetition, systems drift. Without maintenance, presence weakens. This is why calendars are sacred, why festivals recur, why offerings follow schedules. These are not traditions born of habit. They are mechanisms designed to counteract the slow hostility of time itself. Arrival does nothing to stop this process. The Anunnaki, therefore, are not beings who arrive and then settle. They arrive and then struggle to remain. Their actions after arrival reveal ongoing adjustment rather than successful adaptation. They revise agreements. They alter human conditions. They respond to crises that arise not because they failed to anticipate Earth, but because Earth does not allow complete anticipation. Noise, again, becomes a telling example. If arrival had meant adaptation, human activity would not disrupt divine rest. The gods would exist on a plane unaffected by sound. But the tablets say otherwise. Noise reaches them, it disturbs them, it forces response. This alone demonstrates that divine presence operates within the same physical system as human life, not above it. Even the decision to create humans reflects this failure of adaptation. Humanity is not created as an expression of generosity or creativity alone. Humans are introduced as a solution to a problem the gods cannot resolve on their own. Labour becomes necessary because maintaining the world directly is unsustainable. This is an admission of limitation, not supremacy. If arrival had meant adaptation, gods would not need intermediaries. They would not need caretakers. They would not need structures that absorb the strain of existence on their behalf. The very existence of humanity as a working class within the cosmic order is evidence that divine beings could not simply integrate into Earth without assistance. The tablets never portray this as a flaw. It is treated as reality. Existence requires division of labour. Survival requires delegation. The gods respond pragmatically to constraints rather than denying them. This pragmatism extends to their internal organisation. Councils form, authority is distributed, decisions are debated. These are not signs of indecision, they are signs of adaptation under pressure. A hostile environment requires coordination. No single being can manage all variables alone. When systems fail, the gods do not deny the failure. They reset conditions. The flood is the most extreme example, but it is not the only one. Lesser corrections occur constantly. Adjustments to human lifespan, changes in ritual emphasis, shifts in divine focus. These are all responses to ongoing incompatibility between divine presence and the world's limits. Arrival, therefore, is not the moment when everything aligns. It is the moment when misalignment becomes unavoidable. The gods discover through experience what Earth demands, and those demands continue to evolve. This explains why withdrawal becomes inevitable. Over time, maintaining direct presence becomes increasingly costly. Systems grow complex, human populations expand, noise increases, environmental instability accumulates. The effort required to remain fully present outweighs the benefits. Withdrawal is not defeat. It is adaptation delayed. Presence becomes indirect. Authority becomes symbolic. Memory replaces interaction. This transition is gradual, not sudden, reflecting the slow realization that arrival never solved the problem it exposed. The Anunnaki do not vanish because they are overthrown or destroyed. They fade because sustaining themselves within Earth's conditions requires more energy than continued presence justifies. The tablets do not dramatize this. They allow it to happen quietly, through omission and distance. Understanding this reframes the entire narrative. The question is not why the gods left, but why staying became untenable, and the answer lies not in rebellion or punishment, but in the simple fact that arrival did not equal adaptation. The world did not become easier because gods were present. It remained difficult, it remained demanding, and it continued to impose limits that no amount of power could erase. As the narrative moves forward, this unresolved tension will become more concrete. The specific demands Earth placed on divine existence will begin to surface, not as abstract needs, but as practical requirements that shaped every interaction between gods, humans, and the world they shared. The Sumerian tablets never describe divine bodies as weightless, immaterial, or detached from the physical world. They do not speak of beings made entirely of light or thought, immune to the conditions of the environment they inhabit. Instead, they describe gods who occupy bodies, who move through space, who consume, who rest, and who are affected by the world around them. This detail is easy to overlook because later traditions gradually stripped divinity of physical limitation. But in the earliest texts, bodies matter, and those bodies require Earth to function. This is not stated as doctrine. It is revealed through implication, through habits, through needs that recur so consistently they become unavoidable. The gods eat, they drink, they bathe, they sleep, they grow tired, they experience discomfort. These are not metaphors layered over abstract forces. They are descriptions of embodied existence operating within a physical system. The bodies of the gods are not human bodies, but neither are they exempt from material dependence. They require sustenance, and that sustenance comes from the earth. Grain, beer, water, oils, incense, animal fat, and prepared foods are repeatedly listed in temple records, not as symbolic gestures, but as supplies. Quantities are measured, deliveries are tracked, storage is monitored. These are the practices of a system maintaining physical needs. Food offerings are described as pleasing to the gods, but the language goes further than ease emotional satisfaction. When offerings are abundant, gods are described as content. When offerings lapse, gods withdraw or become restless. Hunger, in this context, does not mean starvation in the human sense, but it does indicate dependence. The gods do not generate sustenance internally. They receive it. Water plays an even more critical role. Fresh water, specifically, is treated as a life-sustaining substance not only for humans and crops, but for divine bodies as well. The Absu, the deep freshwater realm beneath the earth, is repeatedly described as a source of vitality. Certain gods dwell there or draw strength from it. Contact with these waters is restorative. Distance from them is destabilizing. This emphasis is not accidental. Southern Mesopotamia existed in a precarious relationship with water. Too little meant famine. Too much meant destruction. The Sumerians projected this reality upward. understanding vitality itself as something regulated by access to water. If humans required it to live, there was no reason to assume gods did not. The tablets also describe divine bodies as occupying space in a way that requires accommodation. Temples are not abstract symbols, they are designed environments. Elevated platforms protect against flood. Thick walls insulate against heat. Inner chambers restrict sound and movement. These features are not ceremonial excess. They are environmental controls. Noise again reveals bodily limitation. Sound reaches the gods. It disrupts their rest. Rest is not optional. It is necessary. Sleep is described not as a metaphor for absence, but as a state in which divine awareness is reduced. Gods can be awakened. They can be disturbed. This only makes sense if their bodies require periods of inactivity to remain functional. Heat and cold are also implied pressures. The careful timing of rituals, the use of incense, the emphasis on shade and enclosure suggests that divine presence is sensitive to environmental extremes. Earth's climate is not neutral. It strains bodies, even divine ones. Movement itself is constrained. Gods travel between realms, but travel is described as effortful. It requires preparation. Descent into the underworld is dangerous. Ascent to heaven is not trivial. These transitions affect the body. They carry risk. One of the most revealing aspects of divine embodiment is vulnerability to confinement. Gods can be trapped, bound, restricted to certain domains. This is not symbolic imprisonment. It is spatial limitation. A god confined to the underworld cannot simply will themselves elsewhere. Physical rules apply. This has profound implications for survival. A body that can be confined is a body that depends on its environment to remain viable. The underworld is described as a place that drains vitality. Entry weakens even powerful beings. Prolonged presence there is undesirable. Escape is difficult. The gods' concern with boundaries reflects this vulnerability. Gates matter. Thresholds matter. Permissions matter. The cosmos is segmented, and bodies moving through it must respect those segments. The Anunnaki, in particular, are often associated with the underworld or with judgment roles that require presence there. This association places them in proximity to a domain that is inherently hostile to vitality. Remaining functional within or near such a space would require compensation. Sustenance, ritual reinforcement. This helps explain the intensity of ritual around judgment and fate. These are not casual proceedings. They occur in controlled conditions. They are buffered by ceremony. The environment is shaped to allow divine bodies to operate where they otherwise might degrade. Human bodies, by contrast, are designed to absorb much of Earth's hostility directly. Humans age. They die. Their bodies fail. The gods avoid this fate not by ignoring physical law, but by externalizing maintenance. Humans become part of the system that keeps divine bodies stable. Labor replaces exposure. Humans dig canals so gods do not have to manage water directly. Humans build temples so gods can inhabit controlled environments. Humans prepare food so gods do not forage. Humans absorb noise, disease, and disorder, buffering divine spaces from direct impact. This division is not cruelty. It is necessity. The gods cannot remain embodied within Earth's conditions without assistance. The environment exacts a cost. That cost must be paid by someone. This arrangement also explains why divine bodies are rarely described in detail. The tablets focus on function, not appearance. What matters is not what gods look like, but what they require to continue operating. Their bodies are understood through needs rather than form. When these needs are unmet, consequences follow. Gods withdraw. They abandon cities. They allow destruction to occur. This is not vengeance alone. It is retreat from an environment that no longer supports them. The idea that gods might leave because conditions are unsustainable reframes divine absence. It is not punishment. It is self-preservation. Even immortality, as later traditions imagine it, does not appear in the earliest texts. Longevity exists, continuity exists, but these are maintained states, not inherent properties. Divine bodies endure because systems support them. This also explains why gods fear disruption. Floods do not only destroy humans, they destroy the infrastructure that sustains divine bodies. After the flood, gods suffer hunger. They gather around sacrifices desperately. This is not symbolic remorse, it is deprivation. The famous image of gods swarming offerings after the flood is often read metaphorically. But within this framework it reflects physical need. The system has collapsed. Sustenance is scarce. Divine bodies are weakened. Only when rituals resume does balance return. This pattern reinforces the same truth repeatedly. Bodies require support. The Anunnaki, operating within this reality, are not outsiders immune to Earth. They are embodied participants. Their survival depends on the same environmental logic that governs everything else. As the narrative continues, the specific mechanisms through which this support was provided will become clearer. Not abstract worship, but concrete processes. Not symbolism, but maintenance. The tablets are patient in revealing this. They never declare it outright. They assume the reader understands, and it is only when later traditions strip divinity of embodiment that this foundational logic becomes obscured. What the Sumerians recorded was not a world ruled by untouchable beings, but one sustained by fragile arrangements. Even the gods had bodies, and those bodies needed earth, not as a conquest, but as a system that had to be carefully managed to remain alive within. The Sumerian tablets treat air, water, and stability not as abstract elements or poetic symbols, but as conditions without which existence itself begins to fail. These are not background features of the world, they are active forces that must be regulated continuously, and the texts make clear that divine presence is inseparable from their proper balance. Where later traditions imagine gods dwelling beyond environmental necessity, the earlier Sumerian worldview places even divine beings inside a fragile equilibrium that can be disrupted if these elements fall out of alignment. Air is not described as empty space. It is a domain with weight and consequence. It carries breath. It carries sound. It carries storm and heat. It is the medium through which life persists, and it is also the medium through which disorder spreads. The separation of heaven and earth created air as a distinct realm, but it did not render that realm benign. It became a space that required oversight because it could not regulate itself. Storms emerge from air, wind destroys structures, heat exhausts bodies, dust suffocates crops. These are not minor inconveniences, they are existential threats in the Mesopotamian environment. The gods associated with air are among the most powerful and the most volatile, not because air grants freedom, but because instability moves through it rapidly and without warning. Control of air is control of survival. The texts show repeated concern with breath itself. Breath is life. Loss of breath is death. This is not philosophical speculation. It is observation. In heat, breath becomes laboured. In storms, breath is stolen. In disease, breath fails. The gods, possessing bodies that require function, are not immune to this reality. Breath is not a metaphor. It is a requirement. Water occupies an even more central role. The tablets describe water as the first condition of existence and the last to return when order collapses. Fresh water sustains. Salt water overwhelms. Floods erase boundaries. Droughts erase life. The Sumerians lived in a landscape where water determined everything, and this reality shaped their understanding of divine survival as well. Fresh water drawn from the Abzu is repeatedly described as restorative. Gods associated with it are stabilizing forces. They bring wisdom, healing, and renewal. Their power flows outward through irrigation, springs, and canals. This is not symbolic abstraction. It reflects a system where access to water determines vitality. The careful management of canals is treated as sacred work, Canals must be cleared. Banks must be reinforced. Flow must be controlled. These tasks are assigned divine oversight because failure leads to catastrophe. When canals collapse, fields drown or dry out, cities fail, offerings cease, divine sustenance is interrupted. The gods do not simply command water to behave, they rely on systems to manage it. Humans dig, humans maintain, humans repair. Divine instruction guides these actions, but labour performs them. This division reveals that water resists absolute control. It must be negotiated with continuously. Stability, in this context, is not a static condition. It is a process. It is maintained through repetition, correction, and vigilance. The tablets are filled with lists, schedules, and procedures because order does not persist on its own. Without constant reinforcement, systems drift toward collapse. This is why rituals repeat. This is why festivals recur. This is why offerings are scheduled precisely. These actions reset alignment. They restore balance. They counteract entropy. Missing a ritual is not simply disrespect. It is failure to stabilize the system. For divine bodies, stability is survival. When air becomes hostile, breath fails. When water becomes uncontrolled, sustenance disappears. When systems degrade, divine presence weakens. The gods respond not with transcendence, but with intervention. Noise again illustrates this principle. Sound moves through air. It accumulates. It disrupts rest. Rest is necessary for stability. Without it, decision-making falters. The flood narrative frames noise as a destabilizing force, not a moral failing. Too much activity overwhelms the system. The solution is reduction. Population is controlled. Lifespans are shortened. Limits are imposed. These are not punishments in the later moral sense. They are stabilizing measures. The world cannot sustain unlimited growth without collapse. Even the heavens are not portrayed as permanently stable. Stars move. Planets wander. Eclipses disrupt order. The gods observe these changes carefully. Calendars are adjusted. Rituals respond to celestial shifts. Stability requires attention even beyond Earth. The Anunnaki, often associated with judgment and fate, operate within this framework. Fate is not arbitrary. It reflects balance. When conditions drift too far, fate is altered. Lives end. Cities fall. These decisions are not expressions of cruelty, but corrections. The underworld represents ultimate instability. It is static, unchanging, and draining. Movement ceases. Growth stops. This is why gods avoid it when possible. Prolonged presence there weakens vitality. Stability cannot be maintained in a realm defined by stagnation. The emphasis on air and water also explains the architectural choices of temples. Elevated platforms protect against flood. Thick walls insulate against heat. Inner sanctuaries limit air movement and sound. These are not symbolic gestures. They are environmental controls. Divine presence is strongest where conditions are most carefully managed. This is not coincidence. It is necessity. Outside these controlled spaces, the world becomes too volatile. The tablets never claim that gods created air and water, and then mastered them completely. They describe gods working within these elements, adjusting to their behavior, responding to their changes, and relying on human assistance to keep them within acceptable bounds. This reliance does not diminish divine authority. It defines it. Authority in the Sumerian worldview is not freedom from constraint, but responsibility for maintaining balance within constraint. As the narrative continues, the systems that supported this balance will become more visible. Offerings, temples, labour, silence. Each plays a role in stabilizing conditions that otherwise degrade. Air must remain breathable. Water must remain controlled. Stability must be continuously produced. Without these conditions, divine bodies cannot function, and presence becomes unsustainable. This is not mythology describing a perfect world. It is a record of a world that required constant work to prevent collapse. Even the gods were part of that effort, bound to the same conditions they sought to manage, and it is within this relentless need for balance that the deeper logic of divine dependence begins to fully emerge, setting the stage for the systems humans were required to maintain so that gods could continue to exist at all. The Sumerian tablets approach food and offerings with a directness that leaves little room for later symbolic reinterpretation. They do not frame sustenance as an abstract expression of devotion alone, nor as a purely ceremonial gesture meant only to acknowledge divine superiority. Instead, they treat food as a necessary component of ongoing existence, part of a practical system that allows divine presence to continue without deterioration. Offerings are not optional embellishments to worship. They are functional acts that maintain balance within a world that does not provide effortless abundance, even to gods. The language used in temple records makes this especially clear. Quantities are listed, types of food are specified, timing is precise. Bread, beer, dates, meat, oils, and grains are not mentioned casually. They are accounted for with the same seriousness as any other essential resource. This is not the vocabulary of metaphor. It is the vocabulary of supply. The gods are repeatedly described as eating, not absorbing essence, not feeding on belief, eating. They consume bread, they drink beer, they enjoy rich offerings. When sacrifices are prepared correctly, the gods are described as satisfied. When offerings are delayed or neglected, gods are restless, distant, or angered. These reactions are not moral judgments. They are responses to deprivation. The famous flood narrative makes this unmistakable. After the waters recede and the survivor offers sacrifices, the gods gather around the smoke like flies, according to the text. This description is often softened or spiritualized in later retellings, but its original tone is stark. The gods are hungry. The system that sustained them has been destroyed. Temples are gone. Fields are submerged. Offerings have ceased. Divine bodies are deprived. This moment reveals something crucial. When the human infrastructure collapses, divine sustenance collapses with it. The gods suffer alongside the destruction they caused. This is not poetic irony. It is consequence. The logic behind offerings becomes clear when viewed through this lens. Humans do not feed the gods as an act of flattery. They do so because the gods require input from the world to remain functional within it. Earth does not naturally provide refined sustenance. Raw materials must be transformed. Grain must be harvested, ground, baked. Animals must be raised, slaughtered, prepared. Beer must be brewed. Oils must be pressed, incense must be gathered and burned. All of this requires labour, time, and coordination. The gods do not perform this work themselves. They rely on humans to convert Earth's raw output into usable sustenance. This reliance is not hidden, it is institutionalized. Entire temple economies exist to manage this flow. Priests, brewers, bakers, herders, farmers and scribes all participate in a system designed to keep divine bodies supplied. The offerings are not random. Certain foods are associated with certain gods. Certain quantities are required at certain times. This specificity reflects dietary needs rather than symbolic preference. A god associated with fertility receives different sustenance than a god associated with judgment. A god of water receives offerings aligned with purity and freshness. These patterns mirror functional roles. The emphasis on beer is especially telling. Beer is not simply a drink of celebration. It is a staple. It provides calories, hydration, and safety in an environment where water can be dangerous. The gods drink beer because beer sustains bodies. It is safer than untreated water. It is easier to preserve. It is reliable. Bread plays a similar role. It is portable, durable, dense with energy. It represents the transformation of grain into something that can be consumed efficiently. These are not symbolic qualities. They are practical ones. Meat, reserved for special offerings, provides richness. Fat is valued. Oils are prized. Incense adds another dimension. Smoke carries scent upward. It also alters air quality within enclosed spaces. The gods are said to enjoy its fragrance, but incense also creates a controlled environment. It masks unpleasant smells. It calms insects. It changes atmosphere. These effects matter for embodied presence. The logic of sustenance also explains why offerings must be continuous. A single sacrifice does not last. Food is consumed. Bodies require regular intake. The repetition of offerings reflects this reality. Daily rituals, monthly festivals, seasonal ceremonies, these are feeding schedules. When offerings are interrupted, consequences follow. The tablets record cities falling out of favour, gods abandoning temples, protection withdrawing. These events are not framed as sudden moral judgments. They're gradual. As sustenance dwindles, presence thins. As presence thins, protection weakens. As protection weakens, disorder increases. This pattern appears repeatedly in historical records. When cities prosper, temples flourish. When temples flourish, gods are present. When gods are present, stability holds. When war, famine, or neglect disrupts offerings, divine attention shifts elsewhere. This is not punishment. It is logistics. The gods do not hoard sustenance. They consume what is provided. Excess is redistributed within the temple economy. Leftovers feed priests and workers. The system circulates resources rather than concentrating them indefinitely. This circulation keeps the system alive. The Anunnaki, often portrayed later as distant judges, are part of this same structure. They receive offerings. They participate in rituals. Their authority does not exempt them from need. It situates them within a hierarchy of sustenance. Judgment itself is tied to offering. Appeasement matters. Favour can be restored through correct ritual. Fate is not fixed absolutely. It responds to input. This responsiveness only makes sense in a system where beings are affected by material conditions. The idea that offerings are symbolic nourishment collapses under scrutiny. Symbolic nourishment would not require precise quantities. It would not require specific foods. It would not collapse after a flood. It would not cause gods to gather desperately around smoke. The Sumerians did not imagine belief as food. They imagined food as food. This does not mean gods are weak in a human sense. It means they are integrated. They exist within a closed system where energy must come from somewhere. Earth produces raw material. Humans transform it. Gods consume it. In return, gods provide order, protection, and guidance. This exchange is the foundation of civilization. The creation of humanity itself is framed within this logic. Humans are created to relieve gods of labour, but also to sustain them. The gods could not maintain the world and feed themselves simultaneously. Division of labour was necessary. This division is not described as cruelty. It is described as resolution. The system becomes sustainable only when humans take on the burden of maintenance. The tablets also show anxiety around scarcity. When food supplies are threatened, rituals intensify. Appeals are made. The fear is not just human starvation, it is divine deprivation. A hungry god is a destabilized god. This explains why famine is treated as a cosmic crisis. It threatens the entire structure, not just human survival. Without offerings, divine presence weakens. Without divine presence, order collapses further. The system spirals. The importance of first fruits offerings also fits this logic. The first yield of harvest is given to the gods because it represents assurance of continued supply. It stabilizes expectations. It reinforces trust within the system. Even the language of satisfaction used in hymns reflects bodily reality. Gods are pleased when fed. They rest when content. They withdraw when neglected. These are not emotional metaphors. They describe states of equilibrium. Over time, as divine presence becomes less direct, offerings shift in meaning. They become remembrance rather than maintenance. But in the earliest layers, the function is clear. The gods needed sustenance because Earth did not sustain them automatically. They needed humans to prepare it because raw nature was insufficient. They needed regular intake because bodies degrade without it. This logic underlies everything else. Temples are built to house feeding systems. Calendars exist to schedule them. Labour is organised to supply them. Writing develops to track them. Civilization itself grows around the necessity of sustaining divine presence. When later traditions strip this away, they leave behind gods who require nothing. But those are not the gods of the earliest tablets. Those beings had needs, and those needs shape the world. As the narrative moves forward, the implications of this system will deepen. Sustenance is not just about food. It is about energy, about stability, about preserving presence in a hostile environment. What the tablets reveal, patiently and without exaggeration, is that survival, even for gods, was never guaranteed. It had to be earned daily through systems that converted Earth's resources into something that could keep divine bodies alive within it. And once this is understood, the role of humanity becomes clearer, not as servants of whim, but as caretakers of a fragile balance that sustained everything above and below them at once. The Sumerian tablets never treat temples as symbolic monuments built to impress the gods or to signal devotion alone. They describe them as functional spaces, carefully engineered environments designed to support continued divine presence within a world that was otherwise unstable and difficult to inhabit. Temples were not merely places where gods were honoured, they were places where gods could remain. This distinction matters because it changes how everything connected to temples is understood. Construction details, placement, maintenance, staffing, and ritual schedules all point toward the same conclusion. These structures existed to manage conditions that Earth did not regulate on its own. Within their walls, air could be controlled, sound reduced, water directed, food stored, and order preserved. Outside those walls, instability resumed. The tablets describe temples as houses, not in a metaphorical sense, but as actual residences. Gods are said to dwell there. They enter, they leave, they rest, they receive visitors. They are disturbed when conditions inside their houses are disrupted. This language is consistent across mythological, hymnic, and administrative texts, which suggests it reflects assumed reality rather than literary flourish. Location was the first layer of control. Temples were often built on raised platforms, not only to elevate them symbolically, but to protect them from flooding. In a land where water could erase entire settlements, elevation was survival. A god whose house flooded would lose access to offerings, rest, and stability. The raised temple preserved divine continuity, even when the surrounding city suffered. Orientation mattered as well. Temples were aligned carefully, often according to cardinal directions or celestial markers. This alignment was not aesthetic. It regulated light, heat, and seasonal exposure. It allowed rituals to occur at precise times under predictable conditions. Consistency mattered because divine presence weakened when alignment drifted. Inside the temple, space was segmented. Outer courtyards absorbed noise and movement. Inner chambers restricted access. The innermost sanctuary was quiet, dark, and controlled. This progression was not symbolic hierarchy alone. It was environmental buffering. Each layer reduced interference from the outside world. Sound control appears repeatedly in the texts. Certain activities are forbidden near inner sanctuaries. Silence is enforced during specific rituals. The gods are described as becoming agitated when noise intrudes too deeply. This concern only makes sense if divine bodies are affected by sound. Temples reduced acoustic chaos. Air quality was also managed. Incense was burned not only as an offering, but to shape the atmosphere. Smoke-altered scent deterred insects and calmed enclosed spaces. Ventilation was controlled through architectural design rather than open exposure. Temples were environments where air could be made tolerable for sustained presence. Water systems were integrated directly into temple complexes. Basins, channels, and wells ensured access to clean water. Ritual washing was mandatory, not as symbolic purification alone, but as physical maintenance. Gods associated with water were strongest where these systems functioned properly. When water access failed, temples lost favour. Food storage and preparation areas were part of the temple economy. Offerings did not appear spontaneously. They were produced, stored, cooked, and delivered according to schedule. The temple functioned as a logistical centre. Without this infrastructure, feeding the gods would have been impossible. Staffing reveals even more. Temples employed large numbers of workers, many of whom had no priestly function. Bakers, brewers, herders, cleaners, guards, and scribes all served the temple. Their labour supported divine presence indirectly by maintaining the systems that sustained it. The presence of guards is particularly telling. Temples were protected spaces. Unauthorized entry was forbidden. Disruption was punished. This protection was not merely about reverence. It was about preserving controlled conditions. A breach threatened stability. The gods' reaction to damaged temples reinforces this interpretation. When temples are destroyed in war or neglected during famine, gods are described as leaving. They do not remain invisibly present out of loyalty. They withdraw. This withdrawal is not emotional abandonment. It is loss of habitat. Cities rise and fall, and with them temples flourish or decay. Gods shift allegiance accordingly. A god whose temple is restored returns. One whose house remains in ruin fades from prominence. This pattern appears repeatedly in historical texts. Divine presence follows infrastructure. This also explains why kings invest so heavily in temple restoration. Repairing a temple is not just piety. It is an attempt to restore divine protection. Rebuilding a god's house is rebuilding the conditions necessary for that god to remain active within the city. The language used in royal inscriptions makes this explicit. Kings do not claim to please gods with beauty alone. They claim to provide comfort. They describe making spaces fit for divine dwelling. They boast of restoring rest, order, and abundance. Temples are also described as places where divine decisions are made. Councils occur there. Judgments are rendered. Fate is determined. These activities require stability, quiet, and controlled conditions. The temple provides this environment. Outside the temple, the world is too volatile. Floods, noise, disorder, and decay interfere. Inside, systems compensate. This division mirrors the broader cosmic structure, where order exists only within maintained boundaries. The Anunnaki, often associated with judgment and fate, require such spaces even more. Their function demands precision. Decisions cannot be made amid chaos. Temples provide the conditions necessary for their role to be performed effectively. This also explains why temples are often rebuilt on the same site after destruction. Location matters. Certain places are understood to be more stable, more aligned, more suitable for sustained presence. Abandoning them risks losing access to divine continuity. Temples are not passive recipients of worship. They are active components of survival. Without them, divine presence becomes intermittent at best. With them, presence can be stabilized over generations. Over time, as divine presence becomes more distant, temples shift in meaning. They become symbolic centers rather than functional habitats. Ritual replaces maintenance, memory replaces presence. But in the earliest layers of Sumerian culture, this shift has not yet occurred. At this stage, temples are necessary. They are interfaces between Earth's hostility and divine vulnerability. They absorb pressure, they regulate flow, they create pockets where existence can be sustained. This is why temples dominate the landscape of early cities. They are the reason cities exist at all. People gather around them because they anchor order. Where a temple stands, a god can remain. Where a god remains, stability is possible. Understanding temples in this way clarifies the relationship between gods and humans. Humans are not merely worshippers, they are maintainers of environments. Their labour keeps the system running. The gods do not inhabit the wild, they inhabit constructed spaces. Civilization itself becomes a life support system for divine presence. As the narrative continues, this realization will deepen. Temples are only one layer of the system. Beneath them lie the broader mechanisms that tied human survival and divine survival together so tightly that neither could endure without the other. And it is within that shared dependence that the next structures begin to emerge, revealing why labour, hierarchy and obligation were not imposed arbitrarily, but evolved as necessary responses to a world that offered stability to no one without constant effort. The idea that the gods could simply leave Earth whenever conditions became difficult is a modern assumption projected backward onto texts that never support it. In later religious and philosophical systems, divine beings exist independently of place. They withdraw effortlessly. They transcend environments. They abandon worlds without consequence to themselves. But the Sumerian tablets do not describe gods who move so freely. They describe beings whose existence is tied to location, structure, and continuity. Leaving was not a neutral option. It carried cost, risk, and uncertainty. From the earliest layers of the texts, presence is treated as something established gradually and maintained deliberately. Gods do not appear everywhere at once. They arrive, settle, build, organize, and integrate themselves into the world's systems. Once that integration occurs, separation becomes difficult. The gods do not hover above the world, they embed themselves within it. This embeddedness is visible in how divine identity becomes linked to specific places. Gods are associated with cities. Their names become inseparable from locations. A god is not just a god. It is the god of Eridu, of Uruk, of Nippur. When a city flourishes, its god is powerful. When the city declines, the god's influence diminishes. This relationship only makes sense if divine presence is anchored, not mobile. Leaving such an anchor behind is not trivial. A god who departs abandons their house, their infrastructure, their supply networks, and the accumulated order that sustains them. The tablets never suggest that these things can be recreated instantly elsewhere. They require generations of labour, alignment, and maintenance. Departure means loss. The gods also leave behind their sources of sustenance. Offerings do not follow automatically. Humans feed the gods where the gods are known, remembered, and ritually present. A god who leaves risks being forgotten. Forgotten gods do not starve immediately, but they fade. Their presence weakens. Their influence contracts. Memory is not nourishment. This risk is reflected in the anxiety gods display about neglect. They respond strongly to lapses in ritual. They withdraw when ignored, but this withdrawal is cautious. It is measured. It reflects an understanding that complete separation threatens continuity. The flood narrative illustrates this tension clearly. When the gods decide to reset the world, they do not evacuate first. They endure the consequences of the destruction alongside humanity. After the flood, they suffer hunger. They gather desperately around sacrifices. If leaving was simple, this suffering would be unnecessary. They would have removed themselves from the system entirely. Instead, they remain bound to it. The underworld further complicates the idea of departure. It is not an exit. It is a trap. Gods who descend there are weakened. They risk confinement. Escape is not guaranteed. This is not a realm of retreat. It is a realm of loss. Leaving Earth does not mean ascending freely. It may mean descending into stagnation. The heavens, too, are not presented as empty refuge. They are structured, governed, limited. Gods who dwell there do so under constraints. Authority is distributed. Space is regulated. Movement requires permission. The idea of escaping Earth's hostility by simply relocating upward does not appear in the earliest texts. This suggests that Earth was not one option among many. It was a critical node in a larger system. Leaving it would disrupt that system in ways the gods were reluctant to risk. The Anunnaki, whose roles are tied to judgment, fate, and the underworld, are particularly constrained. Their authority depends on proximity to human life and death. Fate cannot be determined from a distance. Judgment requires presence. The machinery of destiny operates where humans live, die, and act. Abandoning Earth would mean abandoning function. A god without function loses relevance. Relevance sustains presence. This is not an abstract concept. It is reflected in how gods are replaced over time. New gods rise when old ones lose their domains. This happens when conditions shift, not when gods choose freely. The tablets show gods negotiating change rather than escaping it. They impose limits. They adjust systems. They reduce populations. They reorganize labor. These are adaptive strategies, not preparations for departure. The repeated emphasis on restoration rather than abandonment reinforces this. When temples are destroyed, gods demand rebuilding. When rituals lapse, they demand resumption. When cities fall, they seek new patrons, not exile. This persistence reveals an attachment to the world that goes beyond convenience. The gods are invested. This investment also explains why divine conflict often centers on control rather than escape. Gods argue over cities, domains, and authority. They do not argue over who gets to leave. Leaving is not presented as a prize. Control is. The idea of gods withdrawing gradually, becoming more distant over time, fits this pattern. Withdrawal is not departure. It is reduction of presence. Interaction decreases. Visibility fades. But the connection remains. Gods become remembered rather than encountered. Ritual replaces interaction. Symbols replace presence. This slow fading is safer than sudden departure. It allows systems to adjust. It preserves memory. It avoids collapse. Sudden abandonment would destabilize everything. Without divine oversight, canals fail. Laws lose authority. Order collapses. The gods understand this. They do not want chaos to spread unchecked. Chaos threatens them as much as it threatens humans. The Sumerian worldview does not divide existence cleanly into divine and human spheres. It presents a continuum. Gods and humans occupy different positions, but they share the same system. Disruption in one affects the other. Leaving the system entirely would mean entering uncertainty. The texts show gods avoiding uncertainty whenever possible. They prefer known constraints to unknown outcomes. This is why even punishment is calibrated. The flood is devastating, but it preserves a remnant. Humanity is reduced, not erased. Complete erasure would force the gods to confront a world without labour, without offerings, without mediation. That world would be unsustainable. The gods learn this lesson repeatedly. After each correction, they impose more limits. They shorten lifespans. They regulate fertility. They introduce disease and danger. These measures reduce strain without destroying the system. Leaving is never attempted because it would eliminate the system altogether. The Anunnaki's role as determiners of fate reinforces this. Fate binds gods and humans alike. It is not an external decree. It is a structure that governs outcomes. Gods operate within it. They do not stand outside it. This shared constraint means that gods cannot simply remove themselves without consequences. Fate would follow. Balance would be lost. The later idea of gods ascending permanently reflects a shift in worldview, not original belief. As divine presence became less immediate, as memory replaced interaction, departure was reinterpreted as transcendence. But in the earliest texts, the mechanics do not support this interpretation. Gods remain because they must. They remain because their bodies require Earth's systems. They remain because their authority depends on proximity. They remain because leaving risks loss of sustenance, function, and memory. They remain because the underworld offers no refuge and the heavens offer no escape. This does not mean they remain willingly. The tablets suggest fatigue, irritation, frustration. But these emotions lead to adjustment, not abandonment. The gods attempt to make Earth more tolerable rather than leave it. They build systems to buffer themselves, temples, rituals, hierarchies, human labour. These are all substitutes for adaptation that arrival did not provide. Only when these systems begin to fail does presence truly diminish, and even then it diminishes slowly. Understanding this reframes the entire narrative. The gods are not visitors who come and go at will. They are occupants navigating a difficult environment. Their power lies not in escape, but in endurance. As the story continues, the mechanisms that made endurance possible will become more explicit. The gods did not stay because they loved Earth. They stayed because leaving was not an option that preserved them. And it is within this quiet, uncomfortable reality that the deepest dependency is revealed. The gods needed the world as much as the world needed them, and separation threatened both sides equally. This mutual entanglement is the key to understanding everything that follows. Power and survival are often treated as the same thing in later traditions. To be powerful is assumed to mean that existence is guaranteed, that endurance follows automatically from authority. But the Sumerian tablets never merge these concepts. They separate them carefully, sometimes uncomfortably, and in doing so they reveal a worldview in which power does not eliminate vulnerability. It merely changes how vulnerability is managed. The gods described in the earliest texts possess immense power. They shape order, they decree fate, they alter the conditions of life itself, yet none of these abilities removes the fundamental problem of remaining viable within the world they inhabit. Power allows intervention. Survival requires accommodation. The tablets are remarkably consistent on this point, even when the language is subtle. Power, in the Sumerian sense, is relational. It exists within networks of responsibility, obligation, and balance. A god's authority depends on their role within the system. A god who ceases to fulfill a function does not retain power indefinitely. Power must be exercised to remain relevant, and relevance depends on continued presence. Survival, by contrast, is procedural. It depends on routines that must be repeated. Food must be consumed. Rest must be secured. Environments must be controlled. These needs persist regardless of status. A powerful god still requires sustenance. A powerful god still suffers disruption when systems fail. The tablets illustrate this difference repeatedly through moments of crisis. When disasters occur, power is not enough to prevent suffering. Floods overwhelm even divine plans. Famine weakens gods as well as humans. Noise disrupts divine rest despite authority. These events show that power does not grant immunity. It grants response options. Response options, however, are limited by reality. The gods can send storms, but storms destroy the infrastructure that sustains them. They can reduce populations, but reduction also reduces offerings. They can withdraw protection, but that withdrawal destabilizes the system they rely on. Each exercise of power carries trade-offs. This is why divine decisions often appear restrained rather than absolute. The gods do not erase humanity completely. They do not annihilate cities without replacement. They correct, reduce, adjust. These actions reflect survival logic rather than dominance. The distinction becomes especially clear when examining divine hierarchy. Not all gods possess the same power, but all share the same need to survive. Lesser gods labour, greater gods command. But both depend on the system functioning. When labour fails, command becomes irrelevant. When offerings cease, hierarchy collapses. The Anunnaki, often described as judges and determiners of fate, represent a form of power that is abstract rather than physical. They do not manage crops or canals directly. They determine outcomes, yet even this power does not sustain them independently. They still require presence. They still require ritual. They still require environments where judgment can occur. Judgment itself illustrates the difference between power and survival. To judge fate is to exert authority over outcomes, but judgment does not feed bodies. It does not create shelter. It does not regulate air or water. Those functions must be performed elsewhere. This division reveals a layered system where power operates at one level and survival at another. The gods occupy both levels, but neither replaces the other. Power without survival leads to collapse. Survival without power leads to disorder. Balance requires both. The tablets reflect anxiety about imbalance. When power is exercised without regard for survival, consequences follow. The flood nearly destroys the system entirely. The gods learn from this. Afterward, they impose limits rather than repeating annihilation. They recognize that excessive power use undermines survival. This lesson appears in the gradual shift from direct intervention to indirect management. Early texts show gods acting forcefully. Later texts emphasize law, ritual, and fate. This shift reflects an understanding that constant exertion of power is unsustainable. Systems must stabilize themselves. Stability in turn supports survival more reliably than force. Laws regulate behavior. Rituals reinforce alignment. Fate distributes outcomes gradually rather than catastrophically. These mechanisms reduce the need for dramatic intervention. The gods' increasing reliance on such mechanisms signals a recognition that survival cannot depend on power alone. Power is reactive, survival is continuous. This is also why the gods invest in human institutions. Kingship, law codes, calendars, and temple economies are tools that externalize survival work. Humans enforce order so gods do not have to intervene constantly. This reduces strain on divine systems. Power still exists. It is invoked when systems fail, but its role becomes corrective rather than foundational. The gods prefer a world that sustains itself within defined limits. The tablet's treatment of mortality further illustrates this distinction. Humans are made mortal to stabilize population and reduce noise. This is an exercise of power, but mortality also reduces the burden on divine resources. Fewer humans mean fewer offerings required, but also fewer disruptions. This trade-off reflects survival logic. Even divine longevity appears managed rather than inherent. Gods persist across generations because systems support them. When systems shift, gods fade. New gods rise. This process is not violent. It is gradual. It reflects changing conditions rather than overthrow. Power does not prevent this fading. Authority does not guarantee continuity. Only sustained relevance does. This is why memory becomes so important. Remembered gods continue to receive offerings. Forgotten gods disappear. Memory is a survival mechanism, not a sentimental one. The gods are aware of this. They demand remembrance. They insist on ritual repetition. They attach themselves to festivals and calendars. These practices reinforce presence across time. Power can enforce obedience, but it cannot enforce remembrance indefinitely. Survival requires participation. Humans must continue to engage willingly. This is another reason why power is exercised carefully. Excessive force breeds resistance. Resistance disrupts ritual continuity. Disruption threatens survival. The tablets depict gods who understand this balance intuitively. They reward loyalty. They punish selectively. They negotiate rather than dominate absolutely. These behaviors reflect survival strategy rather than weakness. The distinction also clarifies why divine conflict often centers on authority rather than destruction. Gods compete for cities, worshippers, and domains because these provide sustenance. Victory means survival. Loss means fading. The Anunnaki's authority over fate positions them at a critical junction. Fate governs outcomes that affect survival indirectly. Crops fail. Wars occur. Lives end. These outcomes shape human behavior and resource flow. Through fate, the Anunnaki influence the system that sustains them. Yet fate itself does not guarantee survival. It must be applied within limits. Excessive misfortune destabilizes the system. Excessive prosperity creates noise. Balance must be maintained. This balancing act is visible throughout the texts. It is never stated explicitly, but it governs every divine action. Later traditions would reinterpret this careful restraint as moral judgment or cosmic justice. But in the earliest layers, the logic is pragmatic. The gods act to preserve conditions that allow them to remain. Power is a tool. Survival is the goal. Understanding this difference resolves many apparent contradictions in the texts. Why gods tolerate disorder rather than eliminating it. Why they accept limitations. Why they rely on humans. Why they withdraw gradually rather than depart dramatically. They are not omnipotent overseers. They are managers of a fragile system in which they are participants. This perspective also reframes divine benevolence and cruelty. Actions are not judged by moral absolutes, but by systemic impact. A harsh decision may preserve stability. A generous act may create imbalance. The gods choose accordingly. The tablets never invite admiration for power alone. They record consequences. They observe patterns. They reflect a worldview that values endurance over dominance. As the narrative continues, this distinction will deepen further. The mechanisms that prioritize survival over power will become more explicit, revealing why certain divine behaviors appear restrained, repetitive, and procedural rather than dramatic. The gods did not remain on Earth because they could dominate it endlessly. They remained because they could survive within it, and survival required limits, systems, and restraint. Power allowed them to shape the world. Survival forced them to share it. And it is within this tension, between what could be done and what could be sustained, that the true character of divine presence in the Sumerian tablets finally comes into focus, preparing the ground for understanding why humanity became indispensable rather than incidental in the continuation of everything that followed. The Sumerian tablets never announce decline directly. They do not declare that the gods became weaker or that divine vitality diminished over time. Instead, they allow this reality to surface indirectly, through changes in tone, through shifts in emphasis, and through what begins to require explanation where once it did not. Fatigue enters the record quietly, not as an event, but as a condition that gradually shapes behaviour. In the earliest texts, divine action is immediate and direct. Gods speak openly with humans. They intervene personally. They establish order through presence rather than instruction. Over time, this immediacy recedes. Communication becomes mediated. Decisions are delivered through omens, dreams, and ritual formulas rather than direct encounter. This change is not framed as progress. It reads like adaptation to limitation. Fatigue in the Sumerian worldview does not mean exhaustion in a modern emotional sense. It refers to strain accumulating within a system that requires constant effort to maintain. The gods are repeatedly described as burdened. Lesser gods complain of labour. Greater gods complain of disturbance. These complaints are not isolated anecdotes. They reflect systemic pressure. The very creation of humanity is framed as a response to divine fatigue. The gods grow weary of maintaining canals, piling silt, shaping land, and managing the physical labour required to keep the world functional. This is not metaphor. It is stated plainly. Labour drains divine capacity. Relief is required. Even after humans are created, fatigue does not disappear. It shifts. Humans take on physical labour, but management, judgment, and oversight remain. These tasks are less visible, but still demanding. The gods are now burdened with coordination rather than construction. Fatigue becomes cognitive rather than physical. The flood narrative captures a critical moment in this progression. Human noise becomes unbearable. The gods cannot sleep. Sleep deprivation is not a symbolic complaint, it is a functional problem. Without rest, judgment falters. Decisions become reactive. The flood itself can be read as an overcorrection born from strain. After the flood, the texts reflect a change. Measures are introduced to prevent recurrence. Lifespans are shortened. Population growth is restricted. Disease and danger are normalized. These are not acts of punishment alone. They are preventative adjustments designed to reduce long-term strain. The introduction of mortality itself carries the mark of fatigue. Immortal or long-lived humans create prolonged disruption. Shorter lives cycle populations more quickly, preventing accumulation. This reduces pressure on divine systems. Administrative texts reinforce this interpretation. Over time, divine instructions become more procedural. Lists replace narratives. Rituals become standardized. Flexibility decreases. This standardization reflects a need to conserve energy. Procedures require less intervention than improvisation. The gods also increasingly rely on intermediaries. Priests interpret signs. Kings enforce laws. Scribes record decisions. Divine action becomes indirect. This delegation reduces strain but also distances presence. Fatigue is also evident in divine conflict. Earlier texts describe gods competing aggressively. Later texts emphasize hierarchy and order. Authority stabilizes. Open conflict becomes rarer. This shift reflects an understanding that constant struggle is unsustainable. The Anunnaki's role as judges becomes more prominent in this context. Judgment centralizes decision-making. Fate is determined in advance rather than negotiated continuously. This reduces the need for constant intervention. Fatigue leads to formalization. Decline is also visible in the shrinking scope of divine concern. Early gods oversee broad domains. Later gods specialize narrowly. Responsibility is fragmented. This specialization reflects an attempt to manage complexity without overextension. The texts never suggest that gods lose all power. They suggest that power becomes expensive to exercise. Each intervention carries cost. Fatigue encourages restraint. This restraint is often misread as moral evolution. In reality, it reflects resource management. The gods learn which actions destabilize the system and avoid them. Temples become increasingly important as fatigue grows. Controlled environments reduce strain. Gods spend more time in sanctuaries and less time in the open world. Presence becomes localized. The rise of law codes further illustrates this shift. Laws encode decisions permanently, reducing the need for repeated judgment. Once written, law functions autonomously. This is a response to fatigue. Even divine wrath becomes rarer. Instead of dramatic punishment, gradual consequences dominate. This pacing reflects exhaustion with extremes. Decline does not mean collapse. It means adaptation under constraint. The gods are not failing. They are adjusting to long-term wear. The texts also suggest awareness of this process. Laments mourn lost intimacy between gods and humans. These are not nostalgic fantasies. They reflect recognition that something has changed. Fatigue reshapes divine priorities. Survival replaces expansion. Stability replaces growth. Memory replaces presence. This sets the stage for withdrawal without disappearance. The gods remain influential but less immediate. They are still powerful but more distant. Understanding fatigue clarifies why the gods do not simply intensify control when problems arise. Intensification would accelerate exhaustion. Moderation preserves endurance. As the narrative moves forward, this gradual decline will intersect with human agency more directly. Humans will be asked to carry more responsibility. Systems will be externalized further. The tablets never dramatize this transition. They record it patiently, as scribes observed patterns rather than proclaim truths. Fatigue becomes the silent force shaping everything that follows. It explains restraint. It explains distance. It explains why divine presence thins rather than vanishes. And it prepares the ground for the final transformation, where survival is no longer maintained through direct presence at all. but through structures that can operate long after the gods themselves have stepped back, leaving behind systems that remember what they no longer have the strength to enact directly. The Sumerian tablets do not describe humanity as an afterthought, nor as an accident that gods later had to manage. They describe humans as a solution, not a symbolic one, and not a moral one, but a structural one. Humans enter the record at the moment when divine endurance reaches its limits, when the strain of maintaining the world directly becomes unsustainable. Humanity is introduced not to dominate the earth, nor to inherit it, but to stabilize a system that was already showing signs of fatigue. This framing is consistent across mythological, administrative, and ritual texts. Humans are created to take on tasks that gods can no longer perform indefinitely without cost. Canal digging, field maintenance, temple upkeep, food preparation, noise absorption. These are not humiliating assignments. They are essential functions that keep the entire structure from collapsing. The language used to describe human creation is explicit. The gods complain of labour. They rebel against it. They demand relief. The response is not to eliminate work, but to reassign it. Humans are formed from clay mixed with divine essence, precisely so they can function within both realms. They are of the earth, capable of enduring its hostility, but infused with enough of the divine to understand order, instruction, and obligation. This dual nature is critical. Animals cannot replace gods because they lack comprehension. Gods cannot replace animals because they cannot endure constant exposure. Humans occupy the middle ground. They can suffer. They can persist. They can remember instructions and repeat them across generations. This makes them uniquely suited to absorb the strain of existence. Once humans appear, the structure of the world changes immediately. Labour is externalized. Gods withdraw from direct engagement with physical tasks. Divine attention shifts toward oversight, judgment, and coordination. This is not a sign of superiority. It is a sign of necessity. The tablets reflect this transition subtly. Gods stop digging canals themselves. They stop piling silt. They stop shaping land. These tasks do not vanish. They are performed by humans under divine instruction. The work continues, but the burden shifts. Human labour does more than sustain agriculture. It sustains divine bodies indirectly. Food prepared by humans feeds gods. Temples built by humans shelter gods. Silence enforced by humans allows gods to rest. Ritual repetition performed by humans stabilizes alignment. Without human participation, these processes fail. This integration is not framed as exploitation in the earliest texts. It is framed as balance. Humans receive protection, order, and knowledge in exchange for maintenance. When this exchange functions, civilization flourishes. When it breaks down, disorder spreads. The gods do not micromanage human activity constantly. That would defeat the purpose. Instead, they establish frameworks, laws, calendars, ritual schedules. These structures allow humans to act independently while still maintaining alignment. Autonomy reduces strain on divine systems. This is why writing becomes sacred. Writing preserves instructions. It reduces the need for repeated explanation. Once inscribed, a command can endure beyond the presence of its issuer. This is a survival technology, not just a cultural one. Kingship emerges within this same logic. A single human representative mediates between gods and society. This centralization reduces complexity. Rather than addressing thousands of individuals, gods address one authority. Kings enforce divine order, reducing the need for intervention. Law codes function similarly. They encode divine decisions into fixed rules. Once written, law operates continuously. This limits the need for divine judgment in every case. Fatigue is reduced. The Anunnaki's role becomes clearer within the system. As determiners of fate, they influence outcomes indirectly, rather than through constant action. Fate distributes consequences automatically. This further externalizes effort. Human participation is not optional. When humans neglect their role, consequences follow. Floods, famine, invasion. These are not arbitrary punishments. They are systemic failures, maintenance lapses, balance breaks. The tablets repeatedly show gods responding to human failure by correcting behavior rather than replacing humanity. Humans are adjusted, not removed. Lifespans are shortened. Fertility is regulated. Danger is introduced. These measures fine-tune the system rather than dismantling it. This reveals something important. Humans are not expendable. They are necessary. Without them, the gods cannot maintain presence without overextending themselves. The idea that humans were created solely as servants misunderstands this relationship. Servitude implies dominance without dependence. The tablets describe mutual reliance. Humans depend on gods for order and protection. Gods depend on humans for stability and sustenance. This interdependence is uncomfortable by modern standards, but it is consistent within the Sumerian worldview. Existence is not moralized. It is structured. Even rebellion fits into this logic. When humans rebel, gods respond cautiously. Total destruction is avoided. The system is too valuable to erase. Correction is preferred. Over time, human responsibility increases. As divine presence becomes more distant, humans take on more functions. They interpret signs, they enforce law, they preserve memory. Civilization becomes increasingly self-sustaining. This shift is not framed as liberation. It is framed as burden. Humans inherit responsibilities once held by gods. The weight of order transfers downward. The tablets record this without judgment. They do not celebrate it. They acknowledge it. Human suffering increases as responsibility increases. Mortality becomes absolute. Disease spreads. Danger becomes normal. These conditions reflect the cost of sustaining a system without constant divine intervention. Yet humanity persists because it must. The system requires it. This explains why the gods invest so heavily in teaching human skills: agriculture, writing, construction, ritual. These are survival technologies, not gifts of generosity. Knowledge allows humans to function as replacements. Without it, the system collapses. The role of humanity, then, is not accidental. It is structural. Humans become the connective tissue between divine need and Earth's hostility. This role reshapes identity. Humans are not merely inhabitants of the world. They are its caretakers. They absorb instability so gods do not have to. As the narrative continues, this transfer of responsibility will reach its limit. Humans will be left maintaining systems whose original architects are no longer present. And it is in that moment, when humans sustain a world built for gods who have grown distant, that the final implications of divine survival begin to surface, revealing not only why gods stayed as long as they did, but why eventually even this arrangement could no longer be maintained in its original form. There is a point in the Sumerian record where language shifts in a way that is easy to miss if one is reading for drama rather than structure. The gods do not announce a change in policy. They do not proclaim that their rule has altered. But the focus of the text quietly moves away from acts of command and toward acts of upkeep. Dominion does not disappear, but it stops being central. What matters now is not how power is displayed, but how presence is preserved. In the earliest layers, divine authority is demonstrated through direct action. Gods separate heaven and earth. They establish cities. They assign domains. These acts define the shape of the world. But once that shape exists, the problem changes. Creation is not the same as continuation. A world brought into order does not remain ordered on its own. It deteriorates unless something intervenes repeatedly. This is where maintenance becomes more important than dominion. The tablets reflect this shift through emphasis rather than explanation. Fewer texts focus on dramatic divine acts. More focus on lists, schedules, repairs, and restorations. Canals must be cleared again. Temples must be rebuilt again. Rituals must be performed again. The repetition itself tells the story. Dominion establishes. Maintenance sustains. This distinction is crucial because dominion is episodic. It happens in moments. Maintenance is continuous. It has no endpoint. It demands attention every day, not only during crises. For beings already strained by embodiment, environment, and fatigue, this distinction carries weight. Dominion is impressive. Maintenance is exhausting. The gods begin to behave accordingly. They invest less in displays of overwhelming force and more in systems that reduce the need for intervention. Laws replace decrees. Ritual calendars replace spontaneous commands. Fate replaces negotiation. These tools allow order to persist without constant divine exertion. The Anunnaki's role expands precisely at this point. As determiners of fate, they embody maintenance logic. Fate does not require repeated action. Once fixed, it unfolds automatically. This is efficient. It conserves energy. It stabilizes outcomes without continual oversight. Judgment, too, becomes procedural. Rather than responding to each situation uniquely, rules are applied. Categories are defined. Consequences are standardized. This is not moral evolution. It is administrative necessity. The gods are no longer trying to rule every moment. They're trying to keep the system from collapsing. Temples illustrate this transformation clearly. In earlier periods, temples are places of encounter. Gods appear, speak, act. Over time, temples become places of regulation. Offerings are processed. Rituals are executed precisely. Silence is enforced. The god's presence is assumed rather than observed. This assumption is not faith in the later sense, it is functional expectation. If the temple operates correctly, the god remains. If it fails, the god withdraws. Presence becomes conditional on maintenance. Kingship evolves alongside this shift. Early kings are intermediaries who receive direct instruction. Later kings are managers of systems. They restore temples, repair canals, enforce laws. Their legitimacy rests less on divine favour shown through miracles and more on successful upkeep. Royal inscriptions reflect this change. Kings boast less about conquest and more about restoration. They emphasize rebuilding, re-establishing order, renewing rituals. Victory becomes secondary to continuity. This is not because conquest is unimportant, but because destruction threatens maintenance. A conquered city without functioning infrastructure cannot sustain divine presence. Dominion without maintenance undermines itself. Even warfare becomes regulated. Rituals precede battles. Omens are consulted. Limits are imposed. Total annihilation is rare. War is a tool, not an end. Excessive destruction disrupts the system. The gods' relationship with noise also reflects this change. Early texts tolerate chaos. Later texts regulate it. Festivals have rules. Silence is enforced at specific times. Activity is scheduled. The goal is not celebration alone, but control of disturbance. Maintenance requires predictability. Predictability reduces strain. This logic also explains the rise of specialization. Gods take on narrower roles. Humans take on specific professions. Tasks are divided. No one entity manages everything. This fragmentation reduces overload. The cost of this approach is distance. As systems take over, direct interaction diminishes. Gods are less visible. Humans rely on procedures rather than presence. This distance is not celebrated. It is accepted. The tablets record laments for lost intimacy. Songs mourn a time when gods walked among humans. These laments are not calls for return. They are acknowledgements that the system has changed. Maintenance does not inspire awe the way dominion does. It is repetitive, quiet, invisible when it works. But without it, everything fails. The gods understand this. They do not abandon maintenance in favour of spectacle. They commit to it. even as it drains them. This commitment reveals their priorities. Survival outweighs display. Continuity outweighs control. The flood stands as the last moment where dominion overwhelms maintenance. The result is near total collapse. Afterward, the gods never repeat such an act. They learn that resetting the world costs more than it saves. From that point forward, correction replaces domination. Limits replace annihilation. Systems replace force. Humanity's role expands further within this framework. Humans do not merely serve gods. They operate the machinery of maintenance. They become responsible for tasks once performed directly by divine beings. This transfer is irreversible. Once humans take on maintenance, gods cannot resume it without undoing the system. Withdrawal becomes structural, not optional. The Anunnaki, whose authority depends on stable systems, benefit from this shift. Fate operates more smoothly in a regulated world. Judgment becomes consistent. Outcomes become predictable. But predictability comes at a cost. Flexibility decreases. Compassion becomes procedural. Individual cases matter less than systemic stability. The tablets do not judge this trade-off. They record it. Over time, maintenance becomes so dominant that dominion fades into background myth. Gods are remembered as conquerors of chaos, but experienced as guardians of order. Their power is felt through absence of disaster rather than presence of miracle. This is the final stage of divine integration into the system. The gods no longer rule visibly, they preside invisibly. Maintenance replaces dominion not because gods lose power, but because power is no longer the most efficient means of survival. This realization marks a turning point. Once maintenance is externalized fully, divine presence becomes optional rather than necessary. Systems can run without direct oversight, at least for a time. The gods recede accordingly. They are still invoked, still honoured, still feared, but they are no longer everywhere. The world continues, not because gods dominate it, but because maintenance persists. And it is here, at the quiet centre of repetition and routine, that the original question begins to transform. The issue is no longer what gods needed to stay alive, but how long systems built for their survival can continue once those gods no longer actively inhabit them. This is the threshold where endurance gives way to legacy, and where the story begins to move toward its final, unresolved phase. The Sumerian tablets do not record collapse as a single moment. There is no announcement that the balance failed, no declaration that the system sustaining divine presence had reached its end. Instead, the signs appear gradually, scattered across different kinds of texts, subtle enough that they can be overlooked unless read together. These signs are not dramatic catastrophes at first, they are irregularities, deviations, strains that require explanation where once none was needed. One of the earliest indicators is repetition with increasing urgency. Rituals that were once sufficient begin to be emphasized more strongly. Instructions grow more precise. Penalties for neglect become harsher. This tightening of procedure suggests that stability no longer arises naturally from routine. More effort is required to achieve the same result. Maintenance becomes heavier. Another sign appears in the growing prominence of omens. In earlier texts, divine will is expressed through direct action or clear instruction. Later texts increasingly rely on signs that must be interpreted. The future becomes less predictable. Fate must be read rather than announced. This shift reflects uncertainty. When systems are stable, outcomes are reliable. When balance weakens, signs proliferate. Divination expands because confidence erodes. The gods no longer assume that order will hold. They seek information about what might fail next. Humans are instructed to watch the sky, the liver, the patterns of birds, the movement of stars. These practices reflect anxiety, not curiosity. They are attempts to anticipate breakdown before it becomes irreversible. Administrative records also reveal strain. Deliveries of grain fluctuate, temple inventories shrink, labour shortages appear. Workers are reassigned repeatedly. These are not isolated economic problems. They affect the flow of sustenance that divine presence depends on. When offerings become inconsistent, gods grow distant. Laments provide another window into imbalance. These texts mourn the abandonment of cities by their gods. Temples stand empty. Rituals continue, but without effect. The gods are said to have turned their faces away. This language is often interpreted morally, but within the system described by the tablets, it reflects withdrawal due to unsustainable conditions. Cities described in laments are not sinful. They're overwhelmed, flooded, conquered, depopulated. Infrastructure is destroyed. Maintenance becomes impossible. Under such conditions, divine presence cannot be sustained. The gods leave not in anger, but because their support systems are gone. The increasing frequency of warfare is another sign. Conflict disrupts everything the system depends on. Fields burn, canals break, temples are looted, populations scatter. Each war accelerates degradation. The gods attempt to regulate warfare through omens and rituals, but regulation itself signals that war has become destabilizing. Disease also becomes more prominent in later texts. Epidemics are described not as random events but as signs of imbalance. Disease reduces population, which can relieve noise and strain, but it also reduces labour and offerings. This double effect reveals the fragility of the system. Corrections now carry unintended consequences. The shortening of human lifespans, introduced earlier as a stabilizing measure, begins to show limits. Short lives reduce accumulation, but they also reduce continuity. Knowledge transmission weakens, skills are lost, ritual precision suffers. The system becomes harder to maintain as human memory shortens. This loss of continuity is reflected in increasing concern with writing and record keeping. Instructions are inscribed more frequently. Lists grow longer. Redundancy increases. These measures compensate for declining oral transmission. They also indicate that the system can no longer rely on stable human tradition alone. Divine conflict resurfaces in altered form. Instead of dramatic battles, disputes are procedural. Councils debate endlessly. Decisions are delayed. Consensus becomes difficult. This paralysis reflects fatigue and uncertainty rather than strength. The Anunnaki's role intensifies under these conditions. Judgment becomes more frequent. Fate is adjusted more often. This increased activity suggests that automatic balance no longer holds. Manual correction is required. The underworld becomes more active as well. Death increases. Boundaries between realms feel thinner. Ghosts and restless spirits appear in texts more often. These figures represent leakage in the system. Death is no longer contained cleanly. Disorder seeps upward. Astronomical anxiety also grows. Eclipses are recorded obsessively. Unusual celestial events are treated as dire warnings. The sky, once a stable reference, becomes a source of fear. When the heavens behave unpredictably, the entire structure feels threatened. Kings respond to these signs with increasing desperation. They restore temples repeatedly. They reenact rituals. They issue proclamations emphasizing order. These actions are not confident displays of power. They are attempts to hold things together. The gods' responses mirror this desperation. They promise protection, but conditions apply. They demand stricter observance. They impose harsher limits. Mercy becomes conditional. This conditionality reflects scarcity. Resources, attention, and endurance are limited. One of the most telling signs is silence. Certain gods simply stop appearing in texts. Their names fade, their cults shrink. No dramatic story explains their disappearance. They are not defeated. They are not punished. They are no longer sustained. This fading reveals the ultimate consequence of imbalance. When maintenance fails, presence dissolves quietly. Memory lingers for a time, but without infrastructure, even memory erodes. The balance was not destroyed in a single event. It frayed, it stretched, it thinned. each sign reinforced the others. The system became harder to sustain with each generation. The tablets do not panic over this. They observe it. They record responses. They adjust expectations. By the time later Mesopotamian cultures inherit these traditions, divine presence is already diminished. Gods are more distant. Rituals are heavier. Faith replaces familiarity. What remains is structure without inhabitant. Temples stand, but presence is assumed rather than felt. Fate operates, but without visible arbiters. Judgment occurs, but through law rather than encounter. These are not signs of sudden abandonment. They are signs of exhaustion. The balance fails not because it is attacked, but because it demands more than can be provided indefinitely. Maintenance becomes too costly. Fatigue outweighs benefit. This realization does not end the story. It transforms it. Divine survival gives way to divine legacy. Systems persist even as presence fades. And it is in this quiet unraveling, recorded without drama or condemnation, that the final question takes shape. Not whether the gods were defeated, but whether the system built to sustain them could ever have lasted forever in a world that erodes everything given enough time. The answer is never stated. It is implied line by line as the record grows thinner, and the space once occupied by living gods is filled instead by memory, ritual, and the enduring effort of humans trying to maintain what was never meant to be permanent. The Sumerian tablets never describe the gods vanishing in fire, silence, or finality. There is no moment where divine existence ends, no line where extinction is declared. Instead, what the texts preserve is something far more restrained and far more unsettling. The gods withdraw, but they do not disappear. Presence thins, but it does not cease. Influence fades, but it does not collapse. What emerges is a condition that sits between existence and absence, a state where the gods are no longer fully here yet never fully gone. This distinction matters because extinction would imply failure. Withdrawal implies choice shaped by necessity. The tablets consistently frame divine retreat not as defeat, but as reallocation. Presence becomes selective. Engagement becomes conditional. Visibility diminishes, but structure remains. One of the clearest indicators of this process is how divine activity becomes increasingly indirect. Early texts describe gods walking, speaking, eating, and acting openly within the world. Later texts replace these descriptions with signs, omens, decrees, and laws. The gods no longer intervene bodily. They influence outcomes through systems that operate without constant supervision. This is not portrayed as abandonment. It is portrayed as distance. The gods remain concerned with order. They still determine fate. They still receive offerings, but they do so through intermediaries rather than through presence. Temples illustrate this shift with particular clarity. In earlier periods, temples are places where gods arrive, reside, and depart. Later, they become places where gods are honoured rather than encountered. Ritual continues, but encounter is rare. Silence replaces dialogue. This silence is not empty, it is structured. It allows systems to function without interruption. The gods withdraw from daily friction to conserve what remains of their endurance. Extinction would eliminate obligation. Withdrawal preserves it. Humans are still required to perform rituals. Laws still carry divine authority. Oaths still invoke divine witness. The gods remain relevant even when unseen. The Anunnaki's role reinforces this condition. As determiners of fate, they do not need to be visible. Fate unfolds regardless of presence. Judgment operates through consequence rather than encounter. This allows withdrawal without loss of function. Underworld texts also support this interpretation. The dead do not cease to exist. They persist in diminished form. The underworld is not annihilation. It is reduced vitality. The gods mirror this pattern. Withdrawal does not equal non-existence. It equals diminished engagement. This parallel is not accidental. The Sumerian worldview does not favour absolutes, it favours gradation. Life fades into death gradually, presence fades into memory gradually, power fades into authority gradually. Even gods who are said to have left are not described as destroyed, they are described as having turned away, gone distant, or withdrawn to their domains. Their names continue to appear, their rituals continue, their influence lingers. The laments for abandoned cities capture this nuance. Gods are said to have departed but not perished. They leave because the city can no longer sustain them. When restoration occurs, gods can return. This would be impossible if extinction were involved. Return, however, becomes increasingly rare. The cost of re-engagement grows. Systems have degraded. Fatigue has accumulated. Withdrawal proves easier to maintain than presence. The gods learn to endure by reducing exposure. This is survival strategy, not disappearance. Memory becomes a substitute for presence. Hymns preserve names. Rituals preserve patterns. Laws preserve authority. These structures allow divine influence to persist without bodily engagement. Humans begin to relate to gods through expectation rather than experience. Faith replaces familiarity. This transition is not framed as loss of belief, it is framed as loss of access. The gods are still there, but they are not reachable in the same way. This distance stabilizes the system temporarily. Fewer interventions reduce strain. Humans take on more responsibility. Maintenance continues without supervision. But this arrangement also marks the end of an era. Divine withdrawal transforms the nature of order itself. Order becomes impersonal. Law replaces command. Fate replaces conversation. The tablets do not celebrate this change, they record it. Extinction would have been simpler. It would have freed humans from obligation. Withdrawal binds humans more tightly to systems whose architects are no longer present to adjust them. This lingering obligation is one of the most profound legacies of divine withdrawal. Humans continue to maintain temples for gods who no longer arrive. They perform rituals for beings they no longer encounter. They enforce laws attributed to authorities no longer visible. The gods persist as structure rather than presence. This is not failure, it is endurance redefined. The Sumerian worldview accepts that nothing remains fully present forever. Not cities, not kings, not gods. But nothing vanishes completely either. Everything leaves traces. Withdrawal without extinction allows the world to continue without rupture. It avoids collapse. It preserves continuity. The gods choose distance rather than disappearance because distance preserves memory. Memory preserves influence. Influence preserves order. This is the quiet compromise at the heart of the tablets. The gods do not rule eternally. They do not die. They recede. And in doing so, they leave behind a world that must learn to function without constant guidance, carrying forward systems designed for a presence that can no longer be sustained directly. This unresolved state, neither divine rule nor divine absence, defines the final phase of the Sumerian cosmological record, a world haunted by gods who are still there, but no longer fully present. And it is within this haunting distance that the last question emerges naturally, not as speculation, but as reflection. If even gods had to withdraw to survive, what does it mean for a world that continues to operate on structures built for beings who could not remain forever? There is something deeply unsettling and quietly humbling in the realization that the Sumerian tablets never present the gods as self-sustaining in the way later traditions would insist they must be. They do not depict beings who arrive complete, who endure without support, who exist independently of the world they inhabit. Instead, they describe gods who needed systems, environments, labour, and continuity in order to remain present at all. And when those supports weakened, the gods did not conquer the problem. They adapted, reduced their presence, and eventually withdrew. This is not a failure story. It is not a narrative of defeat or collapse. It is a record of limits being acknowledged. If even gods required food prepared by others, controlled spaces to rest, silence to remain stable, and humans to maintain the structures that kept them alive within the world, then power alone was never enough. Existence in this worldview is always conditional. It is always relational. Nothing persists in isolation. The tablets do not ask the listener to admire the gods for their strength. They invite the listener to observe how endurance actually works. Survival depends on cooperation. Continuity depends on maintenance. Presence depends on balance. When any one of these falters, even the most powerful beings must adjust. This perspective quietly overturns the idea that dependence is weakness. In the Sumerian worldview, dependence is simply reality. The world itself is built from interlocking needs. Water depends on canals. Canals depend on labour. Labour depends on food. Food depends on order. Order depends on oversight. Oversight depends on rest. Rest depends on silence. Silence depends on restraint. Nothing exists alone. The gods were not embarrassed by this. They did not deny it. They built systems around it. And when those systems began to cost more than they returned, the gods did not rage against the world for failing them. They reduced their exposure to it. They stepped back. They allowed humans to carry more of the weight. They preserved themselves not by domination, but by distance. There is something profoundly human in that choice. The tablets never say that the gods were abandoned by the world. They suggest instead that the world was simply too demanding to inhabit fully forever. Time eroded structures. Noise accumulated. Fatigue grew. Maintenance became heavier with each generation. At some point, staying became more costly than leaving, even though leaving was never complete. What remained were systems still running, temples still standing, laws still enforced, rituals still performed. Humans continued to do the work that once sustained divine bodies, even after those bodies were no longer present in the same way. This is the quiet inheritance the tablets leave behind, a world operating on structures designed for beings who could not remain, maintained by humans who were never meant to replace them, but had to. And perhaps this is why the Sumerian texts feel so restrained, so careful, so unsentimental. They do not promise eternal guardianship. They do not assure perpetual intervention. They acknowledge something far more difficult, that even gods have limits, and that continuity is never guaranteed, only managed for a time. If even gods needed help, then endurance was never about supremacy. It was about cooperation, humility, and knowing when to step back before collapse made the choice for you. The tablets leave this thought unresolved. They do not draw conclusions. They do not offer comfort. They simply allow the listener to sit with the idea that survival, at every level of existence, depends on shared effort and acceptance of limits. And in that quiet recognition, there is no fear, only the slow understanding that nothing, not even the divine, exists alone for long.